and welcome back to another episode of Royal Academy Book Club, where we are reading The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. This is Chapter 6, which is tiny, and we will probably be doing a double episode today, going straight through that into Chapter 7 as well. As always, these are my co-hosts Morbite and Dilga. And,
Hello.
I'm Atherton Wing, the host, and let's get into it. So the chapter 6 is titled The Downward Spiral, and it's essentially about tilting and how it is bad, and how you should not do that. And although this is true, there isn't a whole lot of advice for how to deal with this in this chapter, and all three of us have read the book The Mental Game of Poker by Jared Tendler, which does a much better job of kind of addressing these topics. So
yeah, I think tilt, well, I think he realizes it's important. It's kind of outside the scope of the book here, and the fact that, like, it's more about learning, right? And it's like, yeah, we sure have to learn how to not tilt, but it's not really part of the, it's sort of a whole different side of it, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah. And in particular, I think he focuses on one very, one insidious kind of tilt, which is essentially mistake tilt, right? He presents the following, which I will quote. Imagine yourself in the following situation. You are a highly skilled chess master in the middle of a critical tournament game, and you have a much better position. For the last 3 hours, you've been pressuring your opponent, increasing the tension, pushing him closer to the edge, and searching for the decisive moment when your advantage will be converted into a win. Then, you make a subtle error that allows your opponent to equalize the position. There's nothing wrong with equality, but you've developed a powerful emotional attachment to being in control of the game. Your heart starts to pound because of the disconcerting chasm between what was and what is. And I mean, like, that hits home, right? It's like, I think we've all been in games where you're quite far ahead, and then maybe there's like a Baron steal or something to that effect.
No one's ever done that.
Yeah, no one's ever done that before.
I have never had that experience.
Yeah, no.
Never.
You might be 2-0 in your Clash games, and then the third game your AD carry lags out in Champion Select and locks Lethal Tempo Zac with no ability to change any of his summoners.
That's not Mr. Tilt. That's bullshit, Riot. I'd like to point out that we did not tilt.
Yes.
And I was in fact quite far ahead.
Yes, but it's very easy to tilt in that situation, I think, is the idea.
Yes.
So the notion is, he says, at a high level, pressing for wins in equal positions often results in losing, right? And this kind of makes me wonder, right? Is there defender's advantage in chess too? Like, is that a thing? For context, right, defender's advantage is, in League of Legends, is this idea that, the minions will, when you get attacked inside of your minion wave, your minions will switch aggro to attack your attacker. The towers will do the same thing, and this creates an advantage for the defending player. And there's, like, other aspects of it as well, but that's kind of the most important one, I feel like. And yeah, so, like, yeah, more about you've actually played some chess, so, like, what's the notion there?
Well, it's not really a defender's advantage in the sense that, like, because you have minions and shit, you have, like, defenders. I mean, an advantage because the minions will attack you, right? But it's like, the further up they move on the board, the more dangerous it is, right? But also, in a turn-based game, the first move almost always has an advantage, and that's certainly true in chess. Is that, like, it's white tend to become, have a slight advantage because it gets to move first, gets to, have the first move on the center.
Like a tempo advantage almost.
Right. And if you have like really high level games, white has like a 55% win rate over black a lot
Yeah.
of the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like not like a huge thing, and I think it definitely be overcome by skill. And like the less skill you have, the less the advantage means, of course. But
Yeah.
it's there, so that kind of can be in the same vein for sure.
You are echoing a bit on Atherson's mic, Maury.
Oh,
I'm what?
I'll
You
turn
theirs and
I'll turn my sound down, and that should make it better. Because I have open ear headphones. It's a sensitive mic. So.
Oh, it wasn't me. It wasn't me that was
Yeah,
echoing.
it was probably actually
it was.
echoing. So does it sound okay,
Okay.
now?
Maury talk.
Hey,
Testing,
what's up,
testing.
man?
Yep, testing, good.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. Yeah. So, I guess I kind of wonder. I think they're, because like actually I think I picked the wrong section of Defender's Advantage, right? Like the more important one I feel like is the one that has to do with skill shots in League, right? Where like if you're walking at the enemy, then like it's like very easy for them to hit you because you're approaching in, right? And the like attacks have like a shorter distance that they need to reach. And in chess it almost feels like it's like a territorial advantage, right? It's like the further forward you move, the more spaces are going to be threatened by at least one piece from your opponent, right?
Right.
So it's like
It's better to think about it, I think, in terms of like actual map macro, like the towers and stuff, maybe as chess pieces rather than the champion minions, because it's like when you think about map and control of squares in chess, it's almost like the same as turrets in League, where it's like, if you don't have this turret, then you don't control this aspect of the map. I control this aspect of the map, especially when the minions pass it.
And so maybe the analogy is actually something more like if you invade when lanes are all even as a jungler, right? Then the enemy is going to be able to respond more quickly, right?
Right.
Just
and
simply
if
due to the
you
distance.
if you invade while they have the timing / wave pushing, then that's really dangerous for you because the other guys don't have any minions to kill or have less minions to kill, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. The reason that I set it up to be even though is the wording of the quote, right? I mean, I think it's quite. It's almost obvious to say that, like, if you're at a disadvantage, trying to push immediately for a win is insane, right? But it's more subtle and it's less obvious to say that if you're even, trying to win immediately can often be.
Well, let's think about that, right? Like, think about an even game state from level 1, and I'm like Twitch versus like I don't know, like Caitlyn or something, or like Switch versus some like even matchup AD carry with no advantages. Well, I'll likely, if I try to force a trade, we'll likely lose equal amounts of health, and then we'll end up being even still, right?
Yeah.
So like, if I
But
wait
that's not
for
trying to
Kaisa,
win.
right? So exactly. So it's like, if I'm trying to go for that trade to try to win, while we're at an even state, like if I'm like pushing too hard because I'm like, I gotta win. This is like, I've lost 2 games. I want to win one, right? And then I force it and make a mistake, then that can be a problem, sort of like he's saying.
Yeah. And like I think maybe the even simplest example that we can give is like if you immediately just walk up and try and hit the tower, you're gonna have a hard time. I mean, like that's like the absolute most naive iteration of that principle, right? But yeah, he talks about this. He gives one piece of advice. He says, right, when the momentum of the game has shifted and you used to be ahead, now you're even again, you got to be really careful about not rejecting lines of play that are back to like playing from even to stay even, right? Don't be fooled by thinking that an equal position is moving in the wrong direction because you used to be ahead and you're still feeling like you're ahead. You know what I mean? It's like people will often it's almost like revenge tilt actually is sort of what it is. It's like you don't want to be even again, and so you just like keep playing like you're ahead and then lose. It's like
Yeah, so it's like, it's just basically saying that sort of the Clausewitzian perspective of like, if you play defensively until you get an advantage, take the advantage, and then play aggressively.
Yeah, something like that. And yeah, I think that's good to pick up on, because we've been talking about Clausewitz a fair bit over the past couple of months, and it's definitely, I think, that principle, right, of like play defensively until you have an advantage and then play offensively. And
right. And then if you go back to a state where you have no advantages, then you have to go back to playing defensively.
Yeah.
But it's like the thing that I want to caution people about is that when people say, "Oh, play defensively," it almost comes off as like, "Hey, you need to play passively," right? But that's not really what we're looking for. We're more looking for like an active sort of. You're looking for that. You're looking for that hole, and you jump on that hole as soon as you see it. Like, oh, I'm playing Twitch versus Kaisa, and Kaisa beats me when she uses a Q. So if she uses a Q on a wave, I can just W auto her down the lane.
Yeah, it's like it's the difference between passively and reactively, right? It's like you have to play reactively, but you don't want to play passively. You don't want to just let all opportunities slide and just
or even look for common advantages, etc.
It kind of goes back to what I was saying. I don't remember whether I talked about it on the show or not, but like, I was talking about like the difference between doing nothing and waiting, right? It's that same thing, right? You don't want to do nothing. You want to know you want to know exactly what you're waiting for, so that when the right factor springs into place, you can immediately react into that and get an advantage.
Right.
But you can't move first. You have to wait.
Right.
But yeah, he says, in order to escape what he calls the brittle dependence on the safety of absolute perfection or duplication, you have to become better at working with errors through employing creative solutions, right? It's the idea that, like, kind of similar to what you've been doing in terms of logic injections recently, right? It's like, if like something bad happens, you're like, this is great. I get to figure out how to play from this weird position now. Like,
yeah,
it's like you have to take that attitude, right? Because if you turn disadvantageous positions into interesting challenges that it's your job to overcome, then that's a lot easier to stomach emotionally than thinking like, oh god, I'm behind and now I'm closer to losing and that's bad. You know what I mean? It's like it puts your head in the wrong spot.
Right.
So you smart.
And
that's the moral of the story here. You came up with that shit.
Hell yeah. And but I also like just small. I use it as a cue, set of keywords to keep myself focused. So like if I notice myself being distracted or getting a little frustrated, then I'll say one of like, this is fine, this is good, or let's do this, or focus on the game, whatever, and then that sort of recenters me immediately. On top of that, so really good stuff.
Yeah. He mentions, like Jared Tendler mentions, that deep breaths can be very helpful, especially after mistakes, as it kind of helps you reset, recenter. He also, amusingly, very difficult to do in the middle of a game of League, but he talks about completely leaving the situation, taking like a run around the block, and then coming back and seeing how you feel then.
That'd be like sometimes like just getting up from the game when you have a minute because you're dead at 40 minutes or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is it's tough because you have to. It's hard because you have to keep your mental map updated of the game state.
Yeah.
Pretty consistently.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think that's probably easier to do when you consider things like the you take like a multi-game perspective, right? And you're talking about like, okay, maybe that was a bad game. Like, let's, leave, take a run, come back, then play the next one. Don't just immediately queue up again.
Cool.
Any Any notions of things you noticed or thought about or wanted to add, Dilga?
Not really, no.
Okay.
As expected, there's not much to add.
So he then tells an anecdote about what he calls the accident, right? So he was walking in New York, and there was a woman that was like crossing the street that had headphones on. She was distracted. She didn't realize that she was walking into traffic at the wrong time. Makes a mistake. And an oncoming biker makes like an absolutely heroic swerve to avoid crashing into her, but like does bump into her and jostles her in the process. And instead of like recognizing that she had made a mistake and stepping back and like being okay, she like turned to yell at him and then was literally hit by a car.
Oh no.
It's like one mistake often spirals into more, right? Let the first be your wake-up call instead of getting you into this downward spiral where you just keep making mistake after mistake after mistake and like actually tilting, you know what I mean? He says, like, when a mistake happens, we start to live in the past rather than staying in the present while we spend time analyzing it or agonizing over it, right? And if you want to maximize your performance, you have to avoid this at all costs in the moment. You actually have to stay present because there's information that's flying at you. You need to be processing that, not some play that happened, 30 seconds ago that you can't do anything about, right? And to kind of add what Jared might say on that topic, he says, you also can very easily like promise yourself that you'll go back and look at that moment afterwards in the replay, and that can help you kind of release the moment in your mind because you're not worrying that you won't learn from it or trying to figure out what would happen. You can rest assured that it won't go unanalyzed and that nothing bad will happen, right? You can just kind of let it go if you actually go back and look. If you don't go back and look, then you'll be tempted to try and figure it out while you're playing, and then that's going to distract you from playing your best in the moment. So certainly good observations from him, but there are other materials that kind of cover these ideas in a lot more detail. And it's actually it for chapter 6. Isn't that sad?
Well, thank you guys. That was a fun time. Bye.
All right, 17-minute session. Seems good. Okay, we call it here.
Wait.
Are we doing the next chapter?
I mean, I'd like to. Do you guys have time?
Yes.
Shall we do it? Okay.
Cool.
So chapter 7, which I actually read earlier today, is called Changing Voice. And he opens the chapter talking about how, kind of coming out of his adolescence, he was just winning everything, on top of the world, doing really well, playing really intuitive chess, and
how relatable.
Just
Just no one ever.
Yeah, having a great time, and it was at this point that then the movie came out, Searching for Bobby Fischer, right? And suddenly he says, I found myself playing to live up to Hollywood expectations instead of for the love of the game. I was living in two worlds, and I started having a peculiar sensation of detachment during tournament games. Sometimes I seemed to play chess from across the room while watching myself thinking. During this time, he also picked up a new chess coach, a Russian grandmaster that was particularly interested in a very different style of play than what felt natural to him. And he has always been a player that thrives in chaos, right? He wants to make the position as confusing as possible because he's more confident in his ability to figure out how it's confusion than he is in your confidence to figure out that. And this chess coach was a much more conservative restricting style, where it was more about just like suffocating the opponents and putting them in a position where they really couldn't do anything, right? And this clashing of styles was extremely disturbing for him. Things started to feel really alien. The mental game strengths that he'd always been able to rely on before started to deteriorate. And he just kind of lost his connection to his game, and he didn't feel like it was his anymore. He ended up taking a little bit of time off before starting university. He had just finished high school, and he traveled Europe during this time. He felt a little bit motivated less by ambition and more by an urge for self-discovery. He kind of wanted to reconnect with what chess had been to him earlier and figure out kind of what was going on there. And in doing so, he developed a method of study that made chess and his life feel a lot more connected. He said that he noticed in his tournament games during this time that sometimes technical superiority proved decisive, but more often somebody cracked, as if a tiny weakness deep in the being suddenly erupted onto the board. So he started kind of focusing really exclusively on those moments where somebody made like a big error of some kind, whether it was him or his opponent, right? And moments that made him think really hard, which he felt like he didn't understand fully in the middle of the game. So he said, in like a 9-round tournament, he would leave with maybe 5 moments, he said. And each of those moves, he would enter into his computer, plus notes on the thought process he'd used in the middle of the game to analyze what he was going to do, and also notes on his emotional state, kind of throughout the whole game, the whole situation, and like what had like led him to where he was at that moment. And with those moments having been recorded, he would then kind of go back and intensely study them until he was able to like reconnect with the position, reanalyze it without the pressure of the competition. And he says, when I looked at the critical position from my tournament game, what had stumped me a few days or hours or weeks before now seemed perfectly apparent. I saw the best move, I felt the correct plan, and I understood the evaluation of the position. I couldn't explain this new knowledge with variations or words. It felt more elemental, like rippling water or a light breeze. My chess intuition had deepened. This was the study of numbers to leave numbers. And he repeats this phrase, numbers to leave numbers, quite a bit throughout this chapter. And to me, it really sounds... it sounds like a couple of different things, and I think that's that it's kind of interesting, right? On the one hand, if we go by Jared's models, right? On the one hand, it sounds kind of like moving from stage 3 to stage 4, right? From conscious competence to unconscious competence, where you get something to the point where maybe you can do it, but then you kind of practice and repeat it until you're able to do it without thinking. But it also sounds quite a bit like moving things from perhaps what are the two from the zone learning model? It's intangible competence to conceptual competence, right? And then kind of all the way through that line of process, right? It's like he has some notion that there's something to be learned from this position, right? And then he just spends like hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours thinking about it and analyzing it and just breaking it apart and trying to figure out what makes it tick. And then once he feels like he understands it, and not just understands it, but like feels the understanding, that's when he stops, right? So it almost feels like pushing something all the way through the zone learning model to me.
It kind of reminds me, I think, of some ways. You know how sometimes I've felt, or I've told you about times where I'm like, hey, like, you know, I was working on something, and then like I felt like a little chink in my gut or something like that, kind of like it's almost like a light bulb in your head, but it's like in your gut. It's kind of like, and then that's when you know, where I knew rather that I fully understood, or rather that like I knew I wouldn't forget that information.
Yeah.
Sort of the same thing, but like sort of in a more systematic and process where it can happen more often, I suppose.
Yeah. And I don't know. It's I wonder whether these insights were a result of the process that he used or the material that he was studying. You know what I mean? Like, is it the fact that he was specifically working on those moments that were difficult and unusual, where the most growth was possible? Or was it the fact that, or was it some artifact of the way that he actually did the studying, right? Which he doesn't go super far into.
I mean, it sounds like if it were me, like when I was studying League, you know, pretty thoroughly about like the fundamentals of my mental, down, watching and analyzing games, and sort of flashcarding things to remember concepts and stuff. It's kind of like that, sort of like taking in as much of that information as you can and trying to like figure out how it fits together. Kind of like almost like you're studying for a class at school, but there's like no exams or whatever. What if how I took it when you talked about that?
Yeah. I think the thing that's interesting to me about this particular example that he gives is that it's fully self-directed, you know? He's like reviewing his games and figuring out like what were the moments that seemed weird to me, you know, where either I messed up or I didn't understand. And there's no concept that he's starting with, you know what I mean? That like has an answer to the situation. It's just like, I felt like this could have been done better, you know what I mean? And like, I wonder where that feeling comes from for him.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I kind of switched thoughts in the middle there. Sorry. So, the idea is, right, that in the chapter when he's talking about this process, this numbers to leave numbers process, right, he mentions that, you know, what he was doing was, you know, he would focus on studying those moments which an error was made or understanding wasn't there, right? Basically where something felt off, right? And I'm wondering, where does that intuition come from? How do you like tell when there was an error or when understanding wasn't there? I mean, I guess it's partially like processing speed, kind of like we were talking about before. It's like if the answer seems to come really slowly, maybe that's a sign that that's like a position that you should think more about. And then I guess you can just use results, right, to talk about like was it an error or not, because in chess it's very clear cut, right? Like if the result is bad, then like you know, it's pretty easy to say then that was an error. But yeah, I guess my wondering is this a powerful method of study because of the material that he's choosing to study, which is kind of what he's focused on? And like basically how he's deciding what to work on? Or is it powerful because of something in the process that he used to work through that material, which he doesn't talk very much about? You know, he just talks about like,
right,
I analyzed
and so
it,
yeah,
you know?
right, which is kind of unhelpful because it's like, because it may have been that he had enough, you know, background knowledge or unconscious confidence knowledge to be able to say this is what I need to work on. But like if we're like at like a beginner's level, like a green belt level, then that's like super hard to figure out, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like I just need to learn everything, right?
Yeah.
So what I would say that was probably a mix of both. I would say that for me, thinking into it, once you find a good process that helps you, disseminate that information quickly and really get a grasp of it quickly, and then if you also on top of that know what areas of your game you need to work on, then that's when it starts to get super efficient. However, I think that as a beginner, if you just need everything, it probably doesn't matter necessarily where you start in terms of gathering information. Because it's like, obviously with like a game like League, you also need to have the motor skill to be able to do the thing, right? But if you're just looking at a completely theoretical point of view for League, then it doesn't really matter necessarily which knowledge you start with, as long as it's like something like, as long as you start with, I guess, back like the maps and turrets and the very basic game life. I don't think it really matters beyond, like what are the basic rules of the game. Then as long as you keep accruing that knowledge and sifting through it and creating mental models, then eventually I think that it'll find its way into being useful.
Yeah. I can agree with all of that, I think. I think by the way that he's kind of framed it, this was in many ways kind of when he was entering the purple belt phase, I guess, right? So I think this probably makes the most sense as advice to purple belts, right? It's like going back to Matt Thornton and right, like what should you be doing as a purple belt? Ask yourself over and over and over again, where am I weakest, right? And it's like if you're identifying like where are those moments in game when you are weakest, where your decision making is not all the way there or the outcome was bad, those are the spots that you want to work the most on, right? And he seems to have kind of come to the same conclusion, right?
Yeah. I also think that it's valuable for a blue belt to like work on what's weakest, but it's also, I think, a lot of ways for me when I was definitely in the early to middle blue belt, I feel like I'm in the later blue belt, edge of purple belt at this point, as far as like getting to execution level rather than getting to consistent execution rather than like learning how to execute.
Yeah.
I definitely found more value in repeating stuff that I was already decent at as an earlier blue belt than I do now, where I feel like now I'm like, if I repeat what I already know, then like, almost like I'm specializing too much, right? Like if you have like your like little, like your little map of your skills, and like as you like get better, you can color in more of the map. Whereas like if somebody just works on as a blue belt just like CSing, then you have like everything else small circle, and your CSing is just like arrow pointing really far upward toward the end of the graph. And it's like, well, sure, but now you have to work on everything else, right? So it's like it makes more sense, I think, to work on things you're decent at, but you also have to take care, right? But at the purple belt, everything is already at a decent level, so you don't have to worry as much about like what am I. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, no, I think it does, right? I mean, it's like it comes back to these connections that we're making between the different authors and kind of what they're talking about, right? And it's like, yeah, like there is a, the whole first part of the book, right? He talks about how he studied the fundamentals and he had a bunch of coaches and like, they all taught him a lot, right? And that was like really, really important for his early chess life. Obviously, he wouldn't have gotten anywhere near where he was if he didn't work his fundamentals really hard first. But kind of once he got to that part where he was like doing really well, but still wanting to get even better, right? And entering that purple belt phase, this was how he pushed even higher, right? When he basically knew all of the concepts that existed. He knew basically all of the knowledge that was out there to be studied about chess. He's kind of up there at the top, right? It's at that point that you need to start employing the zone learning model and working on the kind of stickiest moments in your game in order to progress even higher, right? And the thing that's fascinating, right, is that he noticed too that when he started working on these mistakes, right? He kind of noticed that, similar to what Jared says, there was always like a mental component to these breaking errors, right? And that these were mistakes, these were like mental game mistakes that he was making not just in chess, but in life as well, right? He noted that in life, when he would travel, he really struggled with the transition from one place to another. He would always arrive at somewhere, feel really homesick, and then after about a week, he would like settle into it and he would be okay again, right? And in chess, he would make errors immediately following or preceding big changes, right? Sudden shifts in momentum were totally deadly for him. You know, he would be in like a really fierce battle and then suddenly it kind of freezes up and gets technical and he wouldn't like change gears fast enough, right? And so in both his life and his chess, he needed to work on the overall theme of like accepting change, right? And in chess, that meant taking a deep breath and clearing his mind when he recognized that the situation had changed. And in life, it meant like working to accept that, like, you know, travel's going to happen and, you know, I don't need to be homesick, you know? And that's, I don't know, that's kind of interesting, right? You know, it's like, the deeper you go and the more new concepts you kind of start to develop, you start to be able to transfer learn all of this stuff from like one discipline to another, right? You know? And I mean, like, I don't know. I've certainly had this kind of experience as well, wherein, you know, I'll develop like a new concept for League and then find that like it applies in life as well. I mean, like I'll take you know, maybe the aspect of scaling is a good one that I've kind of thought of. You know, it's like when you know, when you're building a composition or building a team or building a plan for what you're going to do, right? If you totally all in either direction, right, full early game or full late game, both of those are pretty tough to make work because you know, if you all in on the early game, then, you know, if anything goes wrong, then suddenly you're kind of out of luck and it doesn't look so hot for you. And if you focus full on late game, then although it might be really awesome in theory, getting there is really hard, right? And so like in life, right? You can't plan entirely short term and you can't plan entirely long term. You have to both be able to make your day-to-day life work right now and also have somewhere that you want to go that is valuable to you, that like makes the day-to-day worth something. You know what I mean? So I don't know. That's one that I've kind of experienced. Have either of you found like connections between League strategy and like life strategy or life lessons or anything like that?
I find a lot of not just League strategy, but like like strategy in general. Sort of the idea of like what strategy means.
And not for me, no, not really.
Really?
Yeah. There's nothing that comes to mind if I try to find like parallels.
That's kind of interesting. So,
what's the question?
Hello.
Sorry, sir. Can you repeat the question?
Yes.
This is Mr. Eladir.
What's the question?
Hello. So, the question is, have you made any connections between League of Legends strategy and like real life strategy or learning? And I gave the example of thinking about scaling and like planning for different for different areas of like the timeline in the immediate or the far future, right? You know, it's like if you all in on plans for the immediate or all in on plans for the far future, both of those have issues, right? If you only plan for the immediate, then as soon as that's kind of done, you're like out of luck. And if you only plan for the hyper late game, then like how do you get there even, you know? And in life it feels similar. You have to make sure that your day-to-day is like reasonably acceptable to you, but also that you have some kind of a goal that you're moving towards.
Okay.
I do have one.
You're saying that. Oh, am I gonna talk or are you gonna talk? Who's gonna
You
talk?
go for it. I was gonna say after you're done of the thing, but when
Okay.
you're done, that I can say it.
So. Okay. So what you're basically saying is this is like planning for the immediate would be the early game, planning for the later stages of life would be the late game.
Yeah.
Am I
And you want to have
understanding
a
correctly?
balanced composition
Yeah.
in both cases.
Okay. And if we're thinking about the day to day, is one day equal to like one part of the game,
I don't
like
know.
of the match?
However you choose to interpret it, I think it's totally fair.
Yeah, I don't go quite that
Because
granular.
the way that I see it, one thing that I can think of that there's a connection to, like a real life skill. If we're talking about real life skills compared to like the league type of skills that exist, one thing that I would say is the budgeting, the economy.
Yeah.
I think that one big thing that is often overlooked in League of Legends, which also ties into your point about planning for the immediate, but it has more of like a economical view or standpoint. One thing that I can think of is that instead of maybe buying an IE, maybe you should buy something that's less costly, like, I don't know, a Bork, or something that costs much less, also has much faster scaling, such as Lethality. That's a good example. I've seen, for example, Saber playing Twitch ADC with Duskblade. That's an example of like a very early game focused, but at the same time it makes sense too because of his passive. Like he gets the invisibility and then he procs the Duskblade, so it's kind of good. So yeah, in short, I think the economy is something that can be tied into League of Legends from the real life.
Yeah, and it's kind of like this idea that like if you can spend like a little money on something that's more relevant now, and then leverage that into the ability to make more money, then like that's like kind of good, right? It's like in business, right? I think the term is like do things that don't scale so that you can get to the point where you do scale, right? You know, it's like if you're doing a software project and you immediately try to write it in the most verbose, abstract, general way that you possibly can, you're going to wind up with like 1,700 empty folders and no code. You know what I mean? Like, and it's like much better to just like iterate, right? Like get a minimum viable product, keep working that, and then even though it doesn't do what you need it to do, like you now have something, and you can start actually like presenting that to people, and then they give you money to keep working on it instead of you just having a bunch of plans, you know? And it's like having something now, and having something later that are the same thing is not equivalent, right? Like it's that whole idea of inflation, right? It's like the money today is worth more than money tomorrow. And so if you can get an immediate benefit, sometimes that can then be leveraged for more total gain over the long term.
Yeah. Okay, Morabite, what's your take?
Well, I was thinking about sort of, for me, I think that the biggest things that I take from League as far as integrating them into real life strategy, I suppose, would probably be sort of like the mental stuff. A lot of the stuff that I tried to work on for the mental game, sort of like not tilting as hard and not being as angry and not getting as frustrated, really helped me at work and in other aspects of my life. And I sort of realized that those problems that I had weren't League only, but rather it's something that I can take from League and apply to my real life. So I ended up being able to take all those things and sort of become a much happier and much more confident person, and be happier in general from learning those things from League.
Mm-hmm. So, at this point,
And sorry,
yeah, go for it.
I had
If you got
I had
something.
one more thing I just remembered. I couldn't
Yeah, go
remember
for it.
before.
Mhm.
And I think that I wouldn't be in this spot or had learned the tools without having League there. So I think that having League there is what got me to the spot, rather than
Mhm.
I don't think I would have ever made those discoveries had I not been wanting to get gooder or gooder at League. If I didn't want to get gooder at League.
And maybe there's an argument to say that if you had decided to get good at something else, that maybe that would have been a catalyst to learn all that stuff. But
Right.
the
But,
process of pursuing mastery in some form is powerful.
Who knows? But something like that, yeah, for sure.
So, to continue on another quote, Josh says, once I recognized that deeply buried secrets in a competitor tend to surface under intense pressure, my study of chess became a form of psychoanalysis. I unearthed my subtlest foibles through chess, and the link between my personal and artistic sides was undeniable. The psychological theme could range from transitions to resilient concentration, fluidity of mind, control, leaps into the unknown, sitting with tension, the downward spiral, being at peace with discomfort, giving in to fatigue, emotional turbulence, and invariably, the chess moves paralleled the life movement. And I thought that was like a really interesting list of potential areas of study, right? Like, how exciting, right? So to go back and read those again, he says transitions, resilient concentration, fluidity of mind, control, leaps into the unknown, sitting with tension, the downward spiral, being at peace with discomfort, giving in to fatigue, emotional turbulence, and that's it. So, do any of you, do those phrases make any of you think of any lessons that you've kind of learned in League that
I'm
seem
not really
relevant?
I'm not even really sure what those lessons mean, to be completely honest with you. I mean, I know you're talking about the terms and stuff, but it's just not really entirely sure what he's talking about insofar as were those things informing his chess play, or were his chess play informing his spiritual and his mental growth and all that
Both, I
stuff,
think.
right?
I think that's kind of what he was saying, right? Is it's like he would find these connections that seemed to apply both in chess and in life, and discovering the solution to one would kind of imply the solution to the other. Like there's some kind
Right.
of fundamental thing going on there that's connected at some level, right? Because I know,
Right.
what does somebody do when they're in a tense situation, right? They try to exit it. And what happens when you're trying to quickly exit a tense situation? Sometimes that tension explodes on you, right? And so it's I don't know, it's like a staring match almost, you know what I mean? Like if you're more willing to sit there and be uncomfortable than the other guy is, right? Then that gives you a big advantage, because now, you force them to move first, and then you gain the defender's advantage, right? But sitting in that tense position is not easy, right? You have to have a certain level of mental resilience to be able to consistently do that for longer than your opponent can. And I don't know, I could relate that to job hunting, right? It's you have to become comfortable in this position of not knowing how you're doing, not knowing what's going to happen, and just kind of there's like a whole bunch of unknowns going on, and you just kind of have to sit there and continue to perform despite dealing with all of that uncertainty, you know?
Right.
So the notion that like in tense situations you ought to stay calm, you know, is like applicable in both domains, I guess.
Cool. I can agree with that for sure. And I can say that I've had some sort of like, especially when it comes to like, I guess the findings I've had about, you know, deeper breathing and relaxation and stuff have been really
Yeah.
helpful for me. I found myself not becoming more spiritual, but in really finding and cultivating interest in sort of a Zen movement and Zen philosophy as a result of me finding these discoveries.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I'll immediately draw the connections that you've made between League and your work, right? You know, you'll very
Yeah.
often find, you know, oh, like this is something that's working for me at work and I'm struggling with the same problem in League. Can I apply the same solution? You know what I mean? It's like, I think that does a really good, I think that's exactly kind of what he's talking about, right? Is like making these connections between different pursuits and how they're in some ways fundamentally the same because you're making the same kinds of decisions. You're struggling with the same emotional problems, right? And so
Right.
once you figure out what the mental game solution is, even though the like I want to say like instantiation, even though the implementation of it may differ between the two pursuits, the like fundamental theme there of like the mechanic that's solving it is going to be pretty similar, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's I hadn't really thought about that, but that's definitely true, yeah.
It's like in both situations you are a human thinking about something. That's the connection, you know what I mean? Like, and so, you know, you get good at making decisions in one space, big surprise, you get better at making decisions in a different space as well.
Yeah,
Learning is
definitely.
learning no matter what you're learning. Performing is performing no matter what you're performing.
Heck yeah.
Everything's connected, man. Wow, no laughs. GG.
I was smiling.
And that's the end. That's the end of the whole chapter. Okay, never mind. No, there's one last thing. He says also, he also because chess is tournament profession, you can do this, right? He studied his opponent's mental games, and when he would play against them, he would deliberately try to steer the game into positions where they were mentally uncomfortable. He like, if he was like taking the elevator with the person and he like noticed that they were impatient and like tapping their foot, he would like put the game into a spot where they just have to sit there and math it out and like, you know, and where impatience will be a problem for them. And if he saw that they were at dinner and they're like messing with their peas on their plate, then he would like take that as like, oh, like you're somebody who struggles with control, so I'm gonna like, you know, put you in a position where your desire to control things are gonna be messing with you. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. Right? Amateur
Perfect.
analysis into psychological warfare.
That's
Pretty
kind of
crazy.
mean, but I like it.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be pretty effective, right? Like, dang. You know, put your opponents in positions that they're weak in, right? That's kind of the base thought, I think. But
Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of draw a connection between that and like people sort of like do emote spam or like do the,
Yeah.
you know, like the over and over whatever the
Mhm.
like emotes are, so that they can try to unsettle you a bit.
Yeah, the cheeky question mark in all chat when you make a mistake, you know. Just turn up the heat a little bit on it. Yeah. Happens all the time.
And that one, that's like, it really like attacks their ego too, so it makes it harder to
Oh,
not react badly.
Mm-hmm. So, what with that being what it is, I guess it's time for takeaways. Yeah? Who wants to start? I'll do it. I'll
Sure.
start. So, my takeaway, I think, is I want to spend more time with that list of like the stuff that he was talking about in terms of the psychological themes, and I want to make sure that like I've given proper thought to each of those and how they connect to the game and to life and all that. I don't know. I like read that list and I was like, ooh, this is the most important thing in the chapter, right? Like, and I haven't had quite enough time to think through everything yet. So that's
I want that list too, by the way.
yeah. No, I'll post it. Toss that in. Learning and improving. Yeah. So I'm excited to get working on that. That's mine.
Mine would probably be the idea of just sort of like taking information and just studying it. I really like, because like in my past and like learning other games and like learning League in my previous years, sort of what I did was just take a bunch of like YouTube videos and texts and stuff and just kind of like read through it and kind of just like draw connections and stuff. I haven't really done that lately, and that seems like that might be a really good idea. Just like take a bunch of champion info and think about sort of like, hey, what's the thing here, right? Like, what's the connection here? What's the base principle at play in terms of the counterplay, in terms of the fundamentals, in terms of the skills and execution and such.
Yeah.
I really like that idea, and I'm probably going to start doing that.
Cool. I'll be excited to hear how it goes. Mr. Dilga?
I don't really have a takeaway for this time, but it's mostly because I was first, I'm really tired. I played Clash and Tryouts this afternoon, and when we started, I had a friend laying a heavy topic on me, so I was only partly there.
Gotcha.
Which I'm sorry about, but priorities.
Yep.
I'm sure you understand, and so no real takeaways for me.
Okay. And you, Mr. Illider, I know you were only here for a very small portion of it, but...
He actually came in right at the start.
Really?
Yeah, you just didn't hear him.
Wow. Okay. My observance is bad.
Wait, so you didn't hear my dog shit headset and my dog shit keyboard
No, I did not hear.
typing furiously.
At this point.
Okay, so my main takeaway would be it seems like the process of purple to brown is a very introspective process to go through. Takes a lot of self-analysis. And it also takes like a level of abstraction of the game.
Yeah, you probably have to take your abstraction and re-abstract it and like sort of like reevaluate not just what you're doing but the whole model of the game over and over until it gets really, really solid.
Like a thing that I could draw a parallel with in coding would be, instead of thinking in terms of like basic stuff like if and else functions and all that, you think in terms of data structures, or you think in terms of API. You think in terms of very abstract ways to manipulate data.
That really reminds me of an idea that I had really kind of like thought about in college when one of my teachers in philosophy or some class was like, the difference between an amateur student and like a PhD student or professional in the study shows that the professionals take a little bit longer to start the problem because they look at the problem and figure out like, okay, this is this kind of problem, right? They don't get bogged down in the detail. They just know that, okay, based on the kind of thing in this problem, the wording and the description, this is like a conservation of mass problem, right? Whereas somebody would be like, someone at the beginner might be like, well, is this like a like what does the table mean? Like, what's the table doing here, right? Whereas and it's sort of like, as you increase your knowledge and mental models and stuff in League of Legends specifically, it would probably be less of like a, hey, this is a I'm in this matchup and this is really confusing, but rather it's okay, I'm a short range versus a long range champion and he has a burst spell. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
What's my game plan, right? So they kind of chunk it down that way rather than I'm Ezreal Thresh versus Twitch Karma, whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about it in terms of like that and really sort of chunking things down in terms of like buckets to where like, burst versus non-burst, and then putting it that way versus saying all my knowledge is at a champion level, but rather a grouped up in a way that really makes it a lot easier to determine at a glance what your general game plan is going to be.
Yep. Yeah, like the higher level abstraction. It's like both higher and lower level, you know what I mean? It's like, on the one hand, like, you're no longer thinking at the level of the champion, and so it seems like it's like a higher level sort of thing, but on the other hand, you're thinking about like their abilities and what their abilities do, which is almost like a lower level abstractions. I don't really know which direction we're moving in, but yeah, a different level of abstraction from when you start out, I think, is the
right, and abstracting it in a way that allows you to chunk things more efficiently. So like,
yes,
instead of thinking, oh, this is Ezreal and this is the things Ezreal can do, it's like, okay, Ezreal belongs to this class of champions that has a short cooldown poke spell that deals a decent amount of damage and has a getaway, right?
Yeah.
Belongs in that group of champions, which means that you go in that group, if you see Ezreal and you think, okay, he has these aspects of him, and then if you see another champion that has similar aspects, then you can draw back to that sort of bucket there instead of having to build new buckets for every champion.
Yeah. And so at that point, then you can apply many of the play patterns that you were using versus Ezreal to play against that other champion, and suddenly you start to see similarities between the matchup instead of them just being totally wildly different champions, and there's no connection being made between them. Yeah.
Archetypes.
Exactly.
Yeah, essentially.
In a word.
That's the name.
Yeah. Okay,
And that
cool.
was something I had been
It
working
can
on
be,
before, but stopped.
But to go further on that, to extend further, I would say, when thinking in terms of league, we would have to go into like win conditions. We would have to go into matchups and the matchup dynamics, and we would have to go into like how different champions function against each other, like all that stuff. Really, the game, if we're thinking it from an abstract level, we can just deconstruct the game fairly easily, I would say. Really, all it comes down to is you have to first of all learn. You go for the Nexus. You get turrets to get the Nexus. You go for win conditions to get the turrets so that you can get the Nexus. In order to get the win conditions, you then need to get the gold in order to actually take turrets. Therefore, you need the early game, which in that case means you need CSing, you need trading. Then if we would go into like the area of win conditions, we would have to look into team composition, so drafting. Like in draft phase, you have to first of all understand, okay, pick order. What do we pick first? We pick flex picks to like make sure that we don't get banned out, we don't get counter too hard. We pick into a win condition, and then we try to counter the enemy so that they can't pick against our win condition with their own win condition. And so basically at that point we're playing
and like a win condition is not a game element. Like, it is an abstraction laid upon the game element of groups of champions.
Yes.
And that then allows you to think in a more structured way about drafting. And then you
don't have to think about what every champion does. You just have to think about like what the group of champions do. Like, like for
and
example,
it's like lines of
Andrew.
force in chess, right? It's like you're looking and you're like, it's like a wombo comp versus a poke comp, right? And like, it might be there might be hundreds and hundreds of different champions that you could put together that would all fall under that same basic dynamic, and like, yeah,
and and then it just makes it easier to think about, I suppose, which is pretty sweet, to be honest.
It allows you to speed up the conclusion coming to.
And this
That was a
makes a lot
sentence.
of sense. Like, it makes a lot of sense when you think about how LS and really high level players coach. Like all you can tell that their knowledge is just chunked differently than the rest of us, right? Because
Oh yeah.
because you can kind of just tell that they're just pulling all this stuff out, and like they're not thinking about the specific champions. They just like know that this is like in a game where this ability works this way. This is the counterplay, regardless of what champion it is, right? But the counterplay is the same to the same thing, regardless of how it's different particles or whatever whatever.
Yeah.
The counterplay to Ezreal Q is the same as Morgana Q, for example.
Mm-hmm. Except for that it's slower.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying. Like, despite the fact that it's slightly different in the fact that they move different and stuff,
Skill shots are
the
skill
essential
shots.
counterplay
You
is
gotta
the
dodge
same.
it. Yeah.
You stand behind
Stand
a
behind
minion,
minions,
stand behind
dodge it.
something,
Yeah.
or walk to the left or right.
Only to the
Well, there's
left.
nothing different.
Never to the
There's
right.
no-
To the right is
there's
for
no
noobs.
difference.
Only left.
Or you stand still.
Or you stand still because they're going to be dumb and try to dodge,
Still
try to
is
like
big brain.
over predict. Hell yeah.
All right. Well, that was fun. I'm
By
gonna
the
close
way,
recording.
Morbite, how's it going with the
See y'all later.